So today we're gonna install a high wing on a C8 Corvette. So the high wing spoiler from General Motors and many of the other manufacturers such as RPI, I believe C7 Carbon has one as well. They have these vertical posts, and this is actually how you attach it to the vehicle itself. There'll be threaded holes in the base. I know the RPI one has one stud and one bolt, and then the center ones have a nut, fiberglass down in it to be used as your threaded hole. So there's some 3M on this one because I actually removed this from my C8 and I went with a body color one. Instead of just having mine repainted, I decided to just replace it. But today we're putting it on a hardtop convertible. The high wing spoiler is the same between the hardtop convertible and the coupe models. A lot of people think that they bolt to the hatch or the trunk, in this case the trunk on the hardtop convertible, but that's not true. They actually bolt to the rear bumper, and that's why they'll work on both models, because the rear bumper's the same. So for the C8 Corvette, you'll have 2 holes that you drill here, 2 holes you drill in the middle of the bumper, and then 2 holes you'll drill on the other side. With that said, most manufacturers come with a template. In this case, I still have my RPI template, so we're going to use that to mark up these holes. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and mark the holes before I even pull the bumper, and then I'll go over how to remove the bumper and what you have to do to the bumper before you can mount the wing. Alright, so I've taken some painter's tape and I've cut out the stencil to drill the holes, and I have everything lined up. I'm actually going to put more painter's tape because I don't want this to slip at all. There's 2 ways of doing this. You can take your drill bit and you can just go to town and start drilling through. I say go to town, be very careful. As soon as you punch through, you want to stop drilling. It's not that crazy. There's nothing in this area underneath the bumper, but in this area you have a portion of the taillight. I think it ends about right here. You just want to be careful. If for some reason you go at an angle, you don't want to nip the back of the taillight case. With that said, you want to make sure all your lines are lined up with what it says on the stencil, right? So when you first put the stencil on, you're going to probably try and do it from the side. Don't do that. There's a line down the center, and it says center template here. I go off the tail of the Stingray emblem on the hatch area, or in this case, the trunk area for the hardtop convertible. So once you have that lined up, go ahead and drill your holes. Different instructions are going to call for different drill bits. But if I've learned anything while installing these, it's better to drill the hole slightly bigger, just slightly bigger. I'm not saying huge. Obviously, you want that hole smaller than the bolt head for the hardware that came with the wing. But if you drill it slightly larger, you have the ability to fine tune it or adjust it without having to go back and re-drill holes if for some reason you're off by just a little bit or the wing doesn't sit flush on one side. Having that hole just slightly bigger allows you to bring it flush. Another thing to note, this wing has been installed before. There is a little bit of 3M on the legs of it. You definitely want to put 3M there. There is like a gutter system underneath the C8's bumper, and I'll show more of that once I have the rear bumper off, for water to drain out. However, I don't want debris and dirt getting around the legs or the posts of the wing and just staying there stuck to the 3M. So make sure that the 3M sits completely inside of the post of the wing, and try and make sure that it can keep water from going down in there, because if you have a steady path for water and debris to flow, eventually it'll just catch up and clog up that hole, which you don't want that either. Alright, so I've already drilled my holes through the template. I have them in there. They're nice and perfect. If you can see, the edge is beveled up a little bit. The way to avoid that is by actually laying some painter's tape. Oh, you can really see it in this one. By laying some painter's tape on the surface before you do it. Now keep in mind this will be under the wing, so you're not going to see it. But the idea is to not let the paint crack. If you're doing this and it's cold out, I would definitely lay some painter's tape and drill through the painter's tape to avoid cracking, I should say, in the paint. If you're in a warm climate where the surface is warm, in this case it is because we live in Hawaii, you don't really have to worry about the paint cracking. So after you have the holes drilled, you can set the wing on there if you've already assembled it. You can set the wing on there and just see what it looks like. But keep in mind, this is a form-fitting wing, so you're actually going to have to push down on the legs to get them to line up to the bolt holes. So this is much easier to do when you have the rear bumper off the car and you can actually run the hardware through. It'll hold it tight and in place. So don't freak out too much if you've drilled your bumper and it doesn't look like the wing matches up perfectly. I've done a couple of these now, and once you start pulling it tight down to the surface, you can actually, flex these just a little bit to get them exactly how you need, especially the center ones. The center ones actually move. So yeah, your next step is to pull the rear bumper. Step is to actually open the trunk. If you have a coupe model, it'll be the hatch. You're going to open the hatch, and you're going to remove these T15 Torx bolts. So you have a number of them across the top of the rear bumper, and then you'll have one in each quarter panel where the quarter panel bolts to the bumper. So you'll have those bolts. A lot of people forget these bolts and then they're tugging on their bumper and they don't know why they can't get it off. So you're going to pull those bolts. They're all T15. And then after I pull those bolts, I go ahead and I jack the car up and I remove the rear wheels. It is possible to pull the rear bumper without removing the rear wheels, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it now. There's plastic clips, and not your traditional kind of clips, but they're almost like plastic bars, and they're glued to the inside of the plastic bumper with a special adhesive. And if you pull on this or you break it and you separate it, then you have to re-glue the ABS bumper back to that plastic bracket, and that plastic bracket is actually what bolts it. Like the stud from the car goes through it. There's a 10 millimeter, and then there's two 7 millimeters in here as well. That it's just way easier to access with the wheel and tire removed and the fender liner pulled back. And I mean, it adds 10 minutes to the process, but it's worth that insurance knowing that you're not going to mess it up or break the edges of the bumper. Once I have the bumper off, I'll actually go over all the interesting things GM did to glue certain brackets for the taillights to mount to, for the edges of the bumper to bolt to. It's kind of interesting how it was done. So as far as tools needed, I think the biggest tool you need is actually a T15 Torx bit. You can have it on a socket. The only recommendation I would make with that is don't tighten with a electric impact or an electric wrench at all with the T15, because you will break the bolts. And I'll show you here in a little bit. Each one of those T15 Torx bolts from General Motors is $11 and some change. It's kind of ridiculous, but I have had to replace one that I broke using a power tool, and I was kind of surprised at how much they cost. So with that said, I went to AutoZone of all places, and I found a T15 screwdriver. This is the part number for it. I want to say this thing was like $8, and it's been an absolute lifesaver when working on the C8, just because you're not going to over torque the bolts, and you're going to be able to remove things and reinstall them pretty quickly. I'm going to throw the T15 Torx bit on an electric wrench, and I'm going to go ahead and remove all of the top Torx bits. And I've had this bumper off before, and there was some plastic washers underneath. We did not reinstall those plastic washers. In fact, I haven't reinstalled them on my own vehicle either. All right, so your next step is to, after you've removed the wheels and tires, is to make sure you've removed the 7 millimeter bolt on the bottom of the mud flap, and you're going to pull from the bottom and then pull up. And then I'll show you how these clips work. They're these metal press clips, and then there's a tab that slides into the inner fender right there. So when you go to reinstall, you're gonna slide that out, or slide that in place as well. Don't forget to slide that in. It'll stick out and it'll rub on the tire sometimes when you hit bumps. So these are those metal clips. If for some reason one of them comes off, it's okay. It happens. Take a flathead screwdriver, push down the prongs in the center, and put them back on the plastic. But yeah, you definitely want to keep them on the mud flap side and not leave them stuck in there. So if you have to take some pliers and a flathead screwdriver to put them back into place, that's no big deal. So there is hardware behind here. These are T15 Torx as well. So this one's not even tight for some reason. The bottom one is, but the top one's not. So once you remove those, I try and use the back of the mud flap kind of as a parts tray so that they don't get lost. So in this case, I'm gonna use the T15 screwdriver. Let's pull the one that's, oh, it's not loose, it just looks loose. So I get it out of place. And then you should be able to just pull on the inner fender. So the back side of this inner fender has the heat shielding for the exhaust right here. So what I like to do is pull it back and tuck it behind the parking brake, just like that. And I fold the top back. You can completely remove this if you want, but I think it's unnecessary because what you're actually going for here, I gotta fold it back just a little bit more, because it's right here under, is that 7mm. There's another one halfway up, and then there you can see the hole for it, but I don't actually see it. And then that stud back there with a 10mm bolt on it, or a 10mm nut on it. So let's see if we can get the camera to focus, but it's the only stud and 10mm nut hanging down right now. So this is kind of difficult to do, especially on a 23 and newer C8, but the 20s through 22s are a little easier, and I'll explain why when we get to the other side. But remove the 7mm bolts and then the 10mm nut from up there. Be very careful that you don't push out on the bumper too much. Extensions are your friend with all of these. If you push out on the bumper too much, you will separate this plastic piece here that's actually glued to the inner side of the ABS bumper. So you don't want to break that. If you do, then you have to glue it, and it's kind of a mess. Then you got to worry about the bumper not lining up with the fender or the quarter panel correctly. All right, so now we're on the driver's side. Same thing, make sure the 7mm bolt is removed. Pull the mud flap. Oh, see, in this case, the metal tab is still in the body of the car. That's really easy to pull out with needle nose pliers. We will do that upon reassembly. We're gonna pull the two T15s. These ones have some debris or something behind them. And then the upper. Fold the inner fender back. We're gonna push it behind the electronic parking brake, and then we have a good view. So on the 20 through 22, there's a ton of space on this side. It's actually the easiest side to remove. On the 23 and newer C8 Stingray and the Z06 models, they moved the ECU or the ECM back here on a bracket. So this area is really, really tight. You can actually see the ECU through the rear bumper vent if you look at it from the outside of the car, and you'll know if your ECU or ECM is in that spot. On the 20 through 22 models, it's in the tunnel of the car, or the very center of the car, and can be accessed through the metal tray on the bottom. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove the two 7mm right here, and then the 10mm nut that's on that stud right there. So then I'm gonna go ahead and move underneath the car. For this part, I'm not gonna lift the car up, but depending on what tools you use, you might wanna lift it up, or how your back is. There's this rear, I call it a diffuser. GM calls it something else, I forget what they call it. But this fiberglass panel here connects the bumper to the inner fender. and to the under trays of the car, which this is also fiberglass. Your exhaust might look different. This is an aftermarket exhaust, but you need to remove this tray. In order to do that, you have 2 T15 Torx on either side, just behind each wheel and tire. So you're going to want to remove those. And then the rest of the bolts under here are 7mm heads. There's quite a few of them. So you can choose how you want to remove those. The only other thing under here that's not a bolt is there is a plastic pop clip right here and right here. You don't need to remove this one. A lot of people remove that one by accident, or they start removing bolts on the front of this under tray. You don't need to do that. Only remove the ones that connect this fiberglass diffuser or rear valence to the back of the under pan. All right, so I removed all the, the 4 T15 bolts and all the 7mm bolts from underneath. Now it's time to remove these plastic clips. So keep in mind, this is your rear diffuser, this, not this. So there's a plastic clip here, but don't remove it. You don't need to. That's for the under tray. So you're gonna want to remove the 2 that are on either side. So in this case, I have a plastic pop clip tool.
You should be able to pry underneath that and pull it from the bottom. So that's one.
Okay. And so I'm gonna have to unplug those. So you're gonna pull back just enough for me to get to those. Alright, so your next step is to remove the taillights. These are our 7mm bolts. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the back side of the taillights. I don't even unplug them. I just kind of move them and set them down inside the bumper. You can see the holes that you drilled earlier. There's one. You can see those, and you can see where they're located and why you have to remove the taillights. So you can also see those internal gutters I was talking about. You can see where water goes from the trunk area in the coupes, from the hatch area. Any of the water that makes it down underneath the bumper, it will all end up here and eventually will drip down, but you can see where debris and stuff sits. I think over time, a lot of people end up removing their bumper just to clean these. All right, so before throwing your wing onto your bumper, once the taillights are out of the way, you want to make sure that you've put the adhesive or the 3M on there. A lot of times the center pieces come with a completely round piece, and then the outside will have at least one piece back here. I've seen it up here before on other models as well. So make sure you actually throw that on there before you run hardware into it. This is the hardware I have for this particular wing. The holes are drilled, the taillights are removed. I have the bumper laid down on a nice cargo blanket so that it doesn't mar it up or tear up the paint in any way. So then we are going to have someone hold the wing on the top side. We're going to go ahead and add the hardware in there, get that wing bolted on.